Well, it is 12:01, so I think we can get started. Thanks everyone for joining us for talking about preservation. This is the 12th episode in our series of preservation noontime chats that Preservation Connecticut has been doing during this COVID time. And it was the brainchild of one of our circuit riders, Stacy Vero, who is on the call with us. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide historic preservation organization. We were established in 1975 by special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. And just this last year, on January 1st, 2020, we officially changed our name to Preservation Connecticut. But our mission remains the same. We are your statewide organization for all things preservation. We preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut communities. And I neglected to introduce myself. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut. Our office is in Hamden on Whitney Avenue in the historic Eli Whitney boarding house for single working men across the street from the Eli Whitney Museum. And we have a staff of 8. Chris Wiegren, our Deputy Director, who monitors our easement program and is editor of our newsletter. Renee Trevere, who is our Mills Making Places project manager and preservation services. Jordan Sorensen, our Development Director and Special Projects Manager. Kristen Hopewood, our Development Assistant. And we have 3 circuit riders, Brad Scheid, Stacy Vero, and Mike Farino. And Stacy and Mike are on the call. And I didn't see Brad on the call, but he may be out there as well. So our circuit riders are our boots on the ground, and they are the ones that you contact with any preservation question that you have. They're our first response team and work with homeowners, municipalities, developers, nonprofit organizations, anyone who's a steward of historic properties. If you have any questions at all, contact us, and our circuit riders will come out and meet with you and discuss your preservation issues. So also part of our mission is education, which is some of the programming that we're doing here today is to broaden our outreach in the state of Connecticut and to bring to all of you the programs and the information that you need for your preservation needs. So today we're really excited to have our colleague and friend, Dr. Leah Glazer from the Central Connecticut State University Public History Program. And Dr. Glazer will talk to us about future preservationists and what CCSU is doing to train these folks. So Leah, you can take it away.
All right, thank you, Jane. You'll see that as I talk that the CCSU Public History Program has a pretty tight relationship with Preservation Connecticut. And I'm also only like a couple miles from Jane right now because I live down in Hamden also. So just a little bit about me. I came to Connecticut in 2002 from the American West from Arizona, where I went to graduate school and got my master's in public history and a PhD with public history as one of the areas of concentration. As an undergraduate, I went to school at Tufts University, where I began majoring in art history. And as I got further into art history, I began to realize that as we got into the upper divisions, that I was really quite interested in the context, more of the context of the art and the architecture, as opposed to the aesthetics. And I think that's kind of the perspective that I take, and one of the reasons that I went and got my master's degree out west in public history. When I went to graduate school, I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to go into museums or preservation, but luckily one of the cool things about public history is it encompasses all of it. And if you could just click once to on the PowerPoint there. Yeah, so I know a lot of you probably aren't familiar with what public history is. It was created as an area of study. It's been around for, arguably over a century, with the formulation of the Park Service and the first grassroots preservationists even before that. But as a academic field and a professional field, it started in 1978 or 9 at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So there's far more public history programs out west than back east here. And it's kind of an umbrella for the idea of historians working in the public. Historians working for a public audience instead of a classroom audience or an academic audience. And it encompasses not just preservation, but also museum studies, policy. It was historians working for government agencies. It was literally any person who was applying historical methodology out in the public. And so, whereas, so there's a difference between sort of the idea of preservation as public history, as opposed to how it was kind of traditionally practiced back here in New England when I came back. Many of the preservation programs are in architecture schools or otherwise. If you could do another click, Jane. So the CCSUMA Public History Program has a historic preservation track since 2006. The program dates back in Connecticut to 2002, and it was the first public history program in Connecticut. It began as primarily museum studies, but when the program got big enough and they wanted to bring on a new faculty member, I came on with the proposal that they add a historic preservation track, because if you'll notice, 2006 is just after 2005 with the passage of the Community Investment Act, which was going to promise a lot of funding to historic preservation. And I thought that there should be homegrown preservationists who should be doing this work. And the public university was the perfect place because, as I'll talk about, preservation in public history is very much about place. That's a central tenet in public history, is the history of place as opposed to just history over time. And who better to tell the history of a place than the people who live here. And while we have many great universities across the state and the region, more local students go to the public university, and there's more of them who are also likely to stay. So this idea of training our own. If you click again, Jane. So there's there's something unique also about, we are the only public history program, and we train preservationists in a history department versus a school of architecture. There's a link there that you don't have to do, Jane, that over the green where it says School of Architecture. That'll take you to just a list of programs in historic preservation from the Preservation Directory. And you'll see that while there are a couple in public history programs, so many of them are in architecture schools or other interdisciplinary study places, which preservation is definitely an interdisciplinary field. So that makes sense. As part of our program, we also have students go out of the discipline. But there are some unique characteristics in which we train our preservationists within a history program. And that's really to ask that central foundational question, why we preserve in the first place and what is important to preserve. And that is a very natural question stemming from what historians kind of do all the time, is decide what is important, what stories are important to tell. So that why preserve question. And the other thing that historians are really, really good about doing is obviously knowing history, knowing the content and really understanding context. And as we'll talk about, historically, preservation wasn't always as much about historical context, and really putting that within a wider, placing individual buildings within a wider understanding and connected to place. We also obviously train our students in historical research methodology and interpretation, which is central to preservation work. We have really good researchers. And so while Others might know their architectural history much better. We know how to research, we know how to dig, and we know how to find stuff. We also talk constantly about historical significance and why things are important to tell. History can be interesting, but the history you really need to convey is the history that is significant, and that's the answer to the so what question. We always have to ask that question. And finally, the rise of material culture, especially within public history, as a legitimate document for which historians can tell our histories, is really important. When I was in graduate school, I would often have fights with my fellow seminar colleagues about the legitimacy of material culture. And one of our biggest pieces of material culture is, of course, structures and buildings, but they can be analyzed in much the same way. And so that's sort of where we come from. We look at buildings as pieces of material culture and not entirely as pieces of art, and as historical documents themselves, and as opposed to more of the aesthetic ideas. Okay, and then next, yeah. So what this means is that as public historians, we really emphasize preservation beyond architecture. And for those of you who are familiar with the National Register of Historic Places, you know that there are 4 different criteria upon which something achieves historical significance. Criteria A is historical context, and B is associated with an important person. Criteria C is, of course, about architecture, and criteria D is generally about the ability to have information that can be revealed later, something like an archaeological site. Because the National Historic Preservation Act kind of was spawned as a response to urban renewal and the destruction of really treasured pieces of architecture like Penn Station, there was a real emphasis on losing these well-known iconic landmarks. And so there was a real focus in the first few years of the National Historic Preservation Act on these kinds of resources. What got lost, however, as that kind of went off and the preservation profession went off in the direction of architecture, was what the historians were doing. Because since the mid-1960s, we had the civil rights movement going on. And the civil rights movement really spawned this fracturing of American history into all of these different emphases. So you see the rise of African American studies programs, you see the rise of Chicano studies programs and Latino studies programs, you see the rise of women's history, you see the rise of labor history, you see all of these different rich historiographies beginning to develop. And all of that historiography was not quite making it into the preservation world in terms of what was being saved. And there's reasons for this that I'll talk of in a second. So I guess for public historians, criterion A is really, really kind of where we feel our place is, and the idea of preserving those stories that are attached to place. And so over on the right here, you see 3 books that I think are really important from the public history perspective in terms of preservation. The first, of course, most of you know about, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Jane Jacobs was a big opponent of urban renewal. And one of the reasons was that it destroyed so many working class neighborhoods. But it was about that more typical architecture than sort of that grand architecture. And got to that importance of people's tie to community and place. And then in 1996, this was few decades later, was Laura Hayden's The Power of Place, which really gave public historians some ways to really think creatively about how we still interpret and preserve history, even if there's nothing left. Because what ends up happening for those first 20 or 30 years of preservation is we're only able to tell those stories with what's left on the landscape. And Dolores Hayden gave us a little bit of a toolbox to show us how we can read the landscape differently and how we can still tell stories when we don't have anything left. And then finally, more recently, but still, I don't know, it's almost a decade old now, is Andrew Hurley's Beyond Preservation, which talks about using public history techniques like community engagement and shared authority, and really getting into the community and figuring out what is important to those communities and how we find that. Historically, the National Register, as I said, has not necessarily reflected these stories because our preservation profession has not necessarily reflected these different populations. We have a pretty homogeneous group of professionals. In the public history program at CCSU, we've tried to address that by diversifying our public history faculty. My co-public historian in my department is our African Americanist, and we just hired a Latino oral historian. But unfortunately, that hasn't quite trickled down to diversifying our students. And that's kind of where we're hoping the future is going, diversifying the preservation profession. But that doesn't mean that we can't train our students to use public history techniques like community engagement, like shared authority, and by really using, not depending on what is not just left on the landscape, and not depending on the information that's still in that's in the archives, because what is put in the archives is usually the records of the people who had power and voice. And so as public historians, we need to take it upon ourselves to find those places that tell those full stories. We can engage techniques like oral history, like other types of material culture, like ethnography, and many public historians have been talking lately about the idea of integrity. A lot of times, buildings that are associated with marginalized or underserved groups don't have the quality of workmanship and craftsmanship and materials. And what was it? The three materials, workmanship, and design. They might not have all of that. That integrity, though, maybe should not be equated with condition, because a lot of times these kinds of resources just haven't been able to be maintained as well. But we still need to emphasize the other pieces of integrity in terms of setting and feeling and association. So these are all things that are right in the public historian's toolbox. And so that's kind of what we like to emphasize in training our students. I can pause and see if there's any questions, or if any of my students out there want to add anything.
If you have a question, you'll have to unmute yourself.
This is Charlie Jansen.
Oh, hi,
I haven't fully read or analyzed The Death and Life of Great American Cities, but it strikes me that what Jane Jacobs is talking about is a very good model of communities that were integral after World War II, that included an extreme diversity of inhabitants from different parts of the world, and also economic strata. And it strikes me that that approach is almost antithetical to the iconic effort that underlies really the original vision of the National Register, which in some ways seems to be in desperate need of an update.
Yeah, there's an irony in that, sort of the grassroots, kind of represented by Jane Jacobs, and the kind of resistance kind of led by the Jackie Kennedy like crew, that even though Jane Jacobs had so much to do with the preservation movement, and I used to start my class with her book all the time, that viewpoint was not infiltrated in early preservation work as much as it should have been. or could have been. And I think people are trying to understand that better, and hopefully I agree that the future of preservation can be more sensitive to what else was lost during urban renewal besides the Penn stations, even though I'm still also sad that Penn Station is gone.
So I just have a concluding thought and comment on that, and
Yep.
that is, but for the original efforts at historic preservation, we would surely have lost much, much more in the whole mix. And like many things, when you think about, well, just to use the term movements, okay, you move on from the initial to what's relevant now. So I think that she's so much more relevant today in terms of the way we think about it. It's not to cast any aspersion, which I'm afraid sometimes I hear, on the saving of the iconic, because there's value in and of it for itself as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It is not an either or. That is sort of a constant struggle we have these days, and it's a constant struggle in the, right now in the culture wars. That just because you're telling the history of marginalized groups does not undermine the history of, the history of the government or the nation as we've always known it. Just because you're raising other heroes does not mean they have to replace the old ones necessarily. It shouldn't be either or. It's that integration that's really important. And perhaps, right now I'm teaching in class what happened over the summer with the monuments. The more people are able to see evidence of American history on that landscape, and that it's not just that one kind of level, the more they may be accepting of learning this history in the classroom or through other avenues. And that you can see a coexistence of the history of patriotic America and the 1619 Project together. They can coexist. Nuance.
Yeah, and just the very, very last comment.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the difference between you as a historian and the public historian approach, as opposed to the approach that an architectural historian would take, because the original capital of Connecticut in Hartford is a building that stands in and of itself on its own architectural merit, just as the you'd say houses of lesser quality or buildings of lesser quality, but just as great integrity, exemplify other types of history today.
And the stories of those buildings can still tell the stories of other groups. They just necessarily haven't, because that historiography was not there. And I'm noticing Kathy's chat about, and that I did have that down in my notes, Kathy, that while the National Register may not recognize as much of the history of marginalized groups, our Connecticut State Register does a little bit better job at that, because what I mentioned about integrity and just other standards, we're able to interpret more on a local level than maybe on a national level. And so that's a great tool we have here in Connecticut as a way to try to fill in the gaps.
Okay. I have a comment, Dr. Glazer.
Yeah,
I was going to build off of what Kathy wrote, is that I kind of agree in kind of what we were just discussing with Jane Jacobs, that I have hope that we can kind of, as public historians, when we insert ourselves into these spaces on local levels, right? It goes so beyond the historical society, like, and some of you know about my recent endeavor with the Planning and Zoning Commission in my town. But we recently got a building saved. We kind of had a deal back and forth. It wasn't on the state register. It wasn't on the national register. So when we approached, this person that was asking for a zone change from an industrial to a business zone, we said, you have to research this property because it has something to do with heritage tourism in the area in which you're trying to build, right? We have Clark Brothers Manufacturing, which is now Kinsman Brewing. Sorry, that's my daughter. And that area attracts a lot of people from the Farmington Canal Trail. It is a whole area that is like, you know, bringing popularity to Southington, but where they want to build this gas station is adjacent to it. So I kind of made that argument as the only commissioner kind of with that heritage mind. So not to go on and on, but it is important as public historians to insert ourselves in those spaces and try different things, because it really is that place-based connection that will motivate local preservation. And sometimes it's just the perspective of preserving that heritage, creating a local identity that can combat some of these endeavors to maybe overdevelop or over-commercialize certain zones. So that was a win. We didn't save the entire property. There's some, a farmhouse that was really like a demo by neglect kind of situation that they literally kind of admitted to during the commission hearing. But we did save a fieldstone carriage house, and it will be part of the conditions of them developing it will to keep that structure and put a historical marker there. So it can happen other ways, but you have to be minded to want to do it. And sometimes that just seems like a huge struggle. Thank you.
So thanks, Christina. And for those of you who don't know, Christina is one of our star students of our public history program at CCSU. And she's bringing it into her community. So on that note, Jane, can you go to the next slide? So some of the work that our students do in the CCSU program is work on state and national register nominations. The program ends with a capstone project, and that's the most typical one for those students who are interested in doing preservation work. We also did, and students do, several of them have done mills that were on the mills list that Preservation Connecticut, then Connecticut Trust developed. A couple students have done barns and farm landscapes that were on the barn survey that Preservation Connecticut did, or then Connecticut Trust. Students have done churches. They always have to partner with a group. It might be Preservation Connecticut, but it might be the local historical society. And that way they get some cred by writing one of these national or state nominations that they get to put on their CVs or resumes. And once you have experience in that, it's often a little bit easier to get more jobs. This picture here of this downtown is downtown New Britain, which is where CCSU is. One of the big things that our preservation class did. I should add that the public history program is a combination of history, traditional history programs, and public history kind of practicum classes. And one of those is a historic preservation class. There's also museum studies and digital history, but would-be preservationists can also take local history to learn those research techniques. They can intern focused on preservation. So there's lots of ways to focus and develop that historic preservation track. But anyway, this the preservation class, one class was able, based on a preservation plan that New Britain commissioned that said they wanted this done or recommended that the downtown should be placed on the National Register. One class several years ago developed sort of a context of significance for the downtown. And then the other one began developing inventory for the downtown and architectural descriptions of the different architectural types, and then of some of the history under each of those themes. It was not able to be done in a semester, but students were able to present at a public meeting to try to convince local people that this was a good idea and that this was not going to kill the downtown, but was actually going to help develop it. And then I was able to kind of finish it up and send it through. And since then, there's been at least five, I think, buildings that have used tax credits, including this one over here on the left. You see that building that's kind of a big white facade. That's a false facade that was put up in the 60s or something. They were able to take that off, and it has really made a difference in what that part of the downtown wall looks like. On the other side of the street is victim of urban renewal that was completely taken out by Route 9. So anyway, the public history program was able to help New Britain in that way. And New Britain's just a great petri just for figuring out how they're trying to use their history to kind of redevelop their future. There are students who have done historic structure reports. There are students who have developed design guidelines. And of course, we like to have our students promote and advocate for historic preservation like Christina's doing through planning and zoning. This picture in front of the high-end appliances store, they're actually in front of the Rayfield building, which is one of the buildings in New Britain that was used tax credits to make market rate apartments in old office space. And it happened to coincide with my preservation class. So we took a cool field trip down to New Britain and were able to be there for the ribbon cutting and the initial tours. And then in the upper right corner there with all those people, often that's outside, but every year, except for this one, for obvious reasons, our students get to go to a big party with all our community partners, and including the preservation community. And it's a way for our students to meet people working in preservation and start to connect with them. And then that one in the top in the middle is Zach and Sally, and they're at a environmental symposium that CCSU runs every year, that usually if the preservation class overlaps, we coordinate something with them to try to get preservation in there and try to emphasize preservation's relevant to environmental issues. So the students create posters alongside all of the climate science people, and we try to advocate for preservation. So next slide. So I do see as part of my mission to advocate for preservation, not the least of which is to ensure employment for my students. So I've been very involved. You can do a click there, Jane, with Connecticut Preservation Action, and do try to get students aware of how they can advocate for preservation, to keep these jobs coming, to keep the Community Investment Act funded, because that's going to create a lot of jobs for future preservationists. I also see it as part of my role and my students' role at CPA is to add a different perspective than people are used to. I think when people usually hear about preservation, they do think of it as only saving these, of gentrification and saving only the great examples of architecture. And I've tried to really emphasize, if you click again, Jane, that at CPA and in testimony that I write about preservation's ties to history and people, that this is not just about saving beautiful buildings, that it's about saving history, and it's about tying people to place. We constantly complain, and the legislators and the General Assembly constantly complain about people wanting to leave Connecticut. And I just don't see that true. They see that as true working at a place like CCSU. If you click again, Jane, I have noticed that my students don't want to leave Connecticut. They are tied to this place. Their families are here. They might want to go away for a little adventure, but the vast majority of them will stay here if they can get a job. If we can home grow our professionals, if we can emphasize ties to place, our students are tied to this place, and they are often the best people to be advocating for saving the places that they grew up in and that they love. Next slide, Jane. So I've been trying to train students in the public history program in the preservation world since 2006. And it started with one person. My first one was Lucas Karmazinas, who is now working for the Connecticut Department of Transportation, but was an independent consultant for a very long time. And luckily, it's really great to go places and see my students. So if you do a click, Jane. Obviously, we have a bunch at Preservation Connecticut. Here's a picture of them at the SHPO conference, I think a couple years ago now. That includes Kristen, Jordan, Aaron, and Mike. And Aaron has now moved on to the next click, State Historic Preservation Office. We also have a student in the museum side of the Connecticut SHPO. She's in charge of Newgate, Morgan Dangle. And then Erin's now doing tax credit work. And then you can keep clicking, Jane. We have consultants working heritage consultants. That includes Christina, I believe. We have people working as independent consultants, both in Connecticut and outside. For architecture firms, Kroski Architects is a great firm that does a lot of historical preservation and restoration work. And we have students writing National Register nominations for them there. Garrett Cody is there now. He did his capstone for them, and they later hired him. He is somebody who went to Virginia for a while, and he came back to Connecticut. We have Lucas at Connecticut Department of Transportation. We have somebody, Zach, at the Waterbury Development Corporation, where he advises as part of his job about preservation issues. We have a student who was both an undergrad and grad who got involved with the federal government through FEMA after the tornado went through Springfield. And he had been working for Hartford Preservation Alliance and such. He then was able to move down to DC to work for FEMA and kind of fly all over the country. Then he got a job at a policy consulting firm in Washington, DC. And as of March or April, like right in the middle as COVID stuff was happening, somehow he secured a job at the Washington, DC Historic Preservation Office. So the SHPO of DC, basically. So we have somebody there outside of Connecticut. Garrett in Virginia had worked for this restoration company, United Building Envelope. And lastly, we have a former Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation employee, and then she came to the Public History program at CCSU and moved on to the Boston Landmarks Commission, where she's working in the archaeology office there. So that's who we have right now. We've had more, a couple people who moved outside the state that I haven't been able to keep in touch with. But increasingly, I'm happy to say, while a lot of people come through the public history program are interested in museums, increasingly we're getting more and more students first being interested in preservation. And it's not just about me convincing them that they need to come and think about preservation as part of their future. So I hope it continues, and I hope we continue to see our homegrown students working alongside the great professionals we already have working in the field of preservation in Connecticut. Any questions?
Thank you, Leah. That was a great presentation. And I'm so proud to see all the touches that we've had with your program.
Thought I'd emphasize those, yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Jane, it's Ed. I keep muting myself, but I think can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Ed.
Oh, good. I'm sorry. I just had a couple of quick things. I think when I think of Jane Jacobs' book, I think of a wrestling match between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses.
Yes.
Just say that was the main.
That was the name of a movie or a book. It was Wrestling with Moses, which was a great, amazing title.
Yeah. Really. And I wondered, how many students do you have in a typical year?
So there's an average of about 25 students at various stages. It was up to 40 about 2.5 years ago, and then I think it was 2018, I just figured this out, now I'm blanking, 2017 or 2018, we really made a push and we graduated about 15 people in 1 year, which is very unusual. It's usually about 5 a year at most. And so, but we were victims of our own success and our program numbers dropped. And so we now have to start building that all up right in time for, COVID. So,
Oh, God.
but we're doing online coursework and we're
Of
maintaining.
course.
Yep.
Well, I'm proud that we have so many of our staff came through your program. That's great.
Me too. Yeah, so I should say that, any questions, obviously, about anybody who might be interested in the program or knows somebody interested in the program, just get in touch with me through CCSU or ask Preservation Connecticut for my contact info. I guess I'll type my email in the chat here.
Leah, we
Yeah.
did have one question from
Yep.
Caroline,
Mhm.
and she asked, what's the role of internships for students in the program?
So that is a great question. So that is part of the required 33 credits is a 3-credit internship. Usually graduate students will do it in between their first and second year if they're full-time. They'll usually do it in the summer, but not always. And it's a way of placing them in sometimes their first professional opportunity, and it often is dependent on what they're interested in doing. So if they're on the preservation track, we certainly have plenty of places to put interns, including Preservation Connecticut, including the State Historic Preservation Office, also places like New Haven Preservation Trust and Hartford Preservation Alliance. We are working on putting a student with Fitzgerald Halliday, which is a consulting group. I believe Stacy worked for them at some point. So trying to give all the different kind of ways into preservation, depending on what their skill set is or their interest level. And then for capstone projects, so for internships are really focused on professional mentoring, and we really want to put them in an office with working professionals who can actually mentor them as professionals. The capstone project, however, is a little more flexible in terms of people may be doing work for historical society, but they're doing a state register nomination or something like that, or maybe providing a building history or part of a historic structure report or something like that. So the capstone is what's required of that is a community partner and a need for a project, so that students just kind of they can't write on anything. Public historians need to produce work, unlike academic historians, where there is a need and there's going to be a product that is going to be used and not just be put on the library shelf. So internships are really important because we can talk about a bunch of stuff in the classroom and we can even do classroom projects, but students really learn the lingo when they get out into the world. And they also get exposed to the different perspectives and disciplines and skill sets of non-historians.
Thank you.
This is Charlie. I asked Jane if I could make one quick comment to the group. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an attorney at Robinson and Cole, and my work is in real property and land use, and I'm past chair of the Connecticut Trust and I'm part of CPA as well. So since I have CPA right here and the Preservation Connecticut here on the same call, I think I'd just like to raise something that I became aware of that is very, very important, that's going on in the Connecticut legislature right now. It is kind of on par to the debate between Moses and Jane. All right, nice way to put it. And it's as follows. Connecticut has something called the Transfer Act, the Connecticut Transfer Act. It regulates environmentally contaminated properties. It's been in effect since the mid-'80s. Many mills in Connecticut and many other buildings that are potential redevelopment candidates, including one I'm working on at 25 Van Zandt Street in Norwalk, which is not an historic preservation building per se, in that it's neither on the Connecticut Register, nor is it on the National Register, but it is of tremendous significant importance as a hat factory and uniform factory from the 1920s as a redevelopment site. And the alignment of reuse of these types of structures is one of the softer applications of the strict rules of historic preservation to reuse. And this law has really been very difficult in terms of the tension of economic development of properties. It is currently being revised in the legislature, It's going to be repealed and reset at the recommendation of both the Department of Economic and Community Development and the DEEP, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, because it's viewed as this tremendous impediment in some unreasonable ways for redevelopment of properties. And anyone who's dealt with mills is very cognizant of this as a huge issue. Anything that can be done to ameliorate this effect or to get properties to have certainty after a quick period of time that they can actually be redeveloped is very important. The joke is that once a property gets into the Transfer Act, it never comes out. In other words, it could be a good development project, but it's stuck under the processes of the DEEP. Imagine me saying that. When they reinstitute this law, they're going to keep all of the present sites that are in the act and under the act, which strikes me as just crazy. It may be an opportunity for the CPA lobbyist and the Preservation Connecticut lobbyist to at least address the question of, can there be some relief for projects, okay, where there actually is economic redevelopment going on or some type of revitalization and reuse to get out of being perpetually under the Transfer Act restrictions, because it's going to create a class of two different value sets: historic buildings, mills that are not under the act, and historic buildings and mills which may be under redevelopment now with good projects behind them that are going to stay stuck under the act. So I just wanted to point that out. If there's anything that lobbyists or students could look into, it would be just great, because it is, you know, let's face it, the financing and economic realities of redeveloping the property is what really affects whether that does in fact happen at the end of the day, whether it's the smaller entrepreneur or the larger tax credit developer.
I think just conveying, you know, we need to continue to advocate and convey that preservation is organic, and it is about the stories and the place. And as much as adaptive reuse has had such success over the last so many years, so many people still don't quite understand that when you say preserve that building, it doesn't mean preserve that building exactly the way it always was.
Right.
And it's about still maintaining that connection to the stories, and not about this pristine document necessarily. So yeah, it's just so much education to really understand why we preserve. I guess going back to that big question, why it's important to preserve.
Thank you for raising that issue, Charlie. That's important for us to know.
It's important.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Brad Scheid. I mean, just to add to Charlie's comment, all lenders, nobody lends in flood zones. So it becomes, at least commercial lenders. And what Charlie's talking about is critical importance for not just mills, but any building that's on a waterway is, and Brownsfield too, but the waterway tends to be the real downer for a lot of the mills. So it's, I also like to add just a quick thing. We actually did it was funded by SHPO, a BCI grant in New Britain that created a demand for that National Register district. And I'll tell you, Leah's groups and students made it happen. I don't know, whenever you do a report and you do all these recommendations, you don't know how it's going to ever be facilitated. And Leah and her class did a great job. So that National Register downtown in New Britain didn't just happen. It was a lot of work that went involved, and Leah's students really took it on. And I think they really learned a lot too. And Leah, I do remember the public meeting. There was great fear about what all the owners were going to do, and where they were going to object.
Threw them into a scary situation. In fact, one of the meetings, and that wasn't the main one that the students were presenting at, but one of the meetings, somebody came with a concealed weapon. Luckily, it was in the public room of the police station. I mean, people were not happy. Yeah. And it was just so much about education, and hopefully now that they're seeing, you know, luckily we had the support of the downtown district and the mayor's office and the city manager, et cetera. So yeah, that was helpful. And something else that you were just saying, Brad, made me think of another way that historians can contribute to some of this kind of work, and relevant to this legislation Charlie was talking about was land use histories, and looking and doing the research for land use histories and understanding what was at a property in the past and the history of the whole property and not just the building on it, can be really helpful in development work. It's one of the other kind of projects we work on.
Great.
And I'd like to open it up to others for questions or comments. You can unmute yourself. I can't see everyone at once.
This is Stacy. We did get one question through the chat, or that came in before the meeting, and they asked, are there good trainings or certifications to get? So what is sort of the end result of your program? You know, you get a BA.
You get a master's degree in public history, although we do have an undergraduate minor for undergraduates. We have and so they would have a major in whatever and a minor in public history. And that will go on their transcript. We are one of the few masters in public history programs. There's a lot of programs out there, including UMass Amherst, who's our primary, like, not really competitor because we're all friends. But they are a history program with a public history track. And so their students get a master's degree in history with a preservation track or a public history track. Ours is a master's in public history, specifically. And so that's what they will come out with. As part of our program, we do require students do workshops and conferences. And so I do encourage, especially students, but often they cost money, so they often don't do it, but to do workshops where they can get some certification, like fixing windows. I wish more students would do that because they can make a lot of money restoring windows. But sort of some of that hands-on, or when I was in graduate school, you know, and I encouraged students, they used to give certificates for going to an oral history workshop or a traditional cultural properties workshop or something like that. That's something I have to work on, is getting some of the, and maybe working with you guys to, when you do have workshops, to produce some kind of certificate that shows a certificate of completion or something. It doesn't have to be on the scale of an academic certificate, that they can put on a resume. So that was a good question.
And we did get one question that's sort of unrelated, but please know that we're going to list the emails of all of our circuit riders at the end. And someone asked how to establish a historic district in their town. So please just contact us and we'll chat about that.
And I had a question for you, Leah, or perhaps your students.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from, you know, welcoming interns, as we like to do, what else could Preservation Connecticut be doing to embrace young professionals or encourage folks to join the preservation field?
Yeah, I guess, you know, we're working with the Connecticut League of History organizations to do the same thing, but kind of what I just said, kind of workshops and skills building workshops that we just don't have the manpower or the resources to do on campus or in the classroom. Because by the very nature of a classroom, we are more about theory and try to do as much practice as possible, but nothing gives people experience like that hands-on experience. And so allowing for those kinds of opportunities. Things you've already been doing, I believe, is just making sure there's always a student discount at events so that I can encourage students to go to those things. That's always an issue. But yeah, and just continuing to be a partner. I mean, because not just internships, but students have been allowed to be partners with capstones, especially if they're struggling to find a project idea occasionally, just because of timing, that sometimes is an issue. But we love any opportunity, yeah, to have the staff come to the soiree, to meet our students and to just know who they are and mentor them and give them some ideas that this is all a field that will be very welcoming to them and the different opportunities available. Whenever I have people come in to talk to the class, I always have them tell their story because it gives students an understanding that people just don't often go straight into their careers, that it takes some work, it takes some networking, and it takes some real willingness to grab every opportunity that you can, that they're not going to come to you, but you should take advantage of all opportunities that do fall your way. And the most successful students are the ones who do that.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. And we do try to reach as many new audiences and people as we can through our different social media platforms and trying to do different types of events or projects that might bring new people into the fold.
Yeah,
so
Christina
anytime there's something that you see or your students see something that they're excited about that want, some collaboration on.
Yeah, absolutely. And we probably do need to do more happy hours. I know there's the Women in Preservation one, and there's the drinking about museums one. Maybe we need to keep expanding opportunities for that, or obviously do a virtual happy hours now that we're all Zooming. But yeah, we'll have to think and be creative. And I really appreciate the support, though, and the relationships.
Us as well. I did see a question come through the chat, someone asking about if you had an interest in salvage architecture preservation.
So I have a pretty good relationship with Joe, the guy from Urban Miners, who's also the recycling guru for Hamden. I know that there's a lot of tension between the preservation and the salvage community, but I've always had a pretty good relationship with him in terms of the idea that salvage helps provide materials to preserve existing buildings. And then that whole environmental piece, it becomes really relevant. So we do talk about that, particularly when we talk about the relationship between preservation and environmentalism. I think, it depends probably on your salvage person or your salvage people, but I think there's certainly an understanding. I mean, you can't do any better than recycling an entire building. But if you can't save the building, then save the pieces to save another building. That's sort of how I see it.
Yeah, and we have several professionals that we work with in that field, and we can, help arrange a site visit to, one of their projects. Or
I think students, even outside, it's a way to bring students who are not necessarily interested in preservation, but but are interested in architecture or more hands-on kind of stuff. I brought Joe to campus many years ago, and he was hoarded by students after he spoke. They were just really excited by what he did. So, yeah.
We're just about at 1 o'clock. Did anyone have a final question? Well, this was a great turnout this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us.
Buddy.
Thank you, Leah. Always a pleasure to have you with us.
See everyone. It's been too long.
Please remember that programs like this are only possible through the support of our members. So if you're not a member, please consider becoming a member today. And we thank you all for your support and your participation. What do I have? And we can share this program, a PDF of this program with all of you, so you'll have these resources and you'll have contacts for the circuit riders. And next week, we're talking, is that the one we're doing, Stacy?
Nope. We're going to be talking to Reverend Harlan from St. PJ's, and he's going to talk about our Saving Faith program a little bit. We're going to talk about that, and then he's going to talk about the reuse of, the use of St. PJ's in New Haven. So.
Right, so that's another installment of our Saving Faith series, where we're trying to help promote the preservation of historic Black churches and exploring ways that we can help support that community. So I hope you'll all join us for that. Mm-hmm. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.
Too.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye, thanks.
Need more of this. Bye.